Imagine this. An empath, fragile and open-hearted, walks unknowingly into the orbit of a narcissist. At first, it feels like light meeting light. The narcissist is charming, magnetic, drawing the empath in with intensity. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight shifts. The empath begins to carry what isn't theirs, the narcissist's anger, their emptiness, their shame. Every wound the narcissist refuses to face is quietly deposited into the empath's soul. And the empath, believing love means self-sacrifice, absorbs it all. Day after day, the empath bends, reshapes, and silences parts of themselves to hold together a relationship that feeds on their energy. They become the container of another's shadow, the unacknowledged healer of someone who has no intention of healing. And soon, the empath hardly recognizes their reflection. They see exhaustion where joy once lived, doubt where trust once breathed. They feel like an echo of themselves, hollowed by the weight of someone else's pain. But here's the turning point. It doesn't come in one dramatic explosion. It comes as a quiet, terrifying clarity. The empath realizes, this pain was never mine. They stop explaining themselves to ears that never listened. They stop carrying storms that were never theirs to calm. They stop running to rescue every emotional emergency. And in that single act of stillness, something extraordinary is born. Carl Jung called this individuation the process of becoming whole by reclaiming what was lost. But for the empath, it feels like something far deeper, the birth of psychological sovereignty. It's the moment they realize they don't need to trade their peace for love, or abandon themselves to be accepted. They no longer seek validation in places that have none to give. And without saying a word, their very presence begins to disrupt old patterns. Others are forced to face the shadows they once projected onto the empath, because the empath no longer accepts the role of scapegoat. This rebirth doesn't come through easy steps or gentle affirmations. It comes through what Jung called the night sea journey, a descent into psychological hell. The empath must be broken open, stripped bare of illusions, walking through the darkness until only the truest self remains. It is agony, yes. But it is also alchemy. When the empath survives this descent, they emerge as something new, what I call a shadow walker. They are no longer the fragile soul who absorbs. They are the one who has seen the depths of human darkness and returned with their light intact, but transformed. Their sensitivity, once used against them, becomes a strength sharper than steel. Their compassion, once exploited, becomes a choice rather than an obligation. Jung once wrote, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." The empath-narcissist bond is that inferno. It is a crucible that either destroys you or forges you into something unbreakable. What the narcissist never realizes is that in trying to consume the empath, they become the catalyst for the empath's greatest evolution. They think they've won, when in reality, they've created something they can never touch again. This is more than healing. It is transformation. It is the kind of evolution Jung believed humanity must undergo, a leap in consciousness born from suffering. The empath who survives doesn't just walk away whole, they walk away sovereign, untouchable, a mirror that forces others to confront themselves. And from that moment on, they are no longer the one who carries shadows. They are the one who walks beside them, unafraid, with a light no darkness can consume. Let's step into the story more deeply. Imagine a person born with a heart that feels everything, a soul so sensitive that the pain of others doesn't just touch them, it enters them, settles inside, and begins to live there. At first, this feels like a gift. They are the friend who listens, the partner who understands, the family member who carries everyone's weight. People are drawn to them because their presence feels like relief, like a safe harbor in the storm. But slowly, quietly, something begins to shift. The very sensitivity that makes them beautiful also makes them vulnerable. Enter the narcissist. At first, the narcissist looks like anyone else. Charming, magnetic, often wounded in a way that makes the empath's heart ache. The empath feels called to heal, to support, to love. But what they don't see is that the narcissist has a hidden vault of darkness inside them, shame, rage, emptiness, wounds they refuse to face. And rather than carry this burden themselves, they project it outward. They hand it to the empath without words, without asking, and the empath, almost unconsciously, accepts it. This is the beginning of what Carl Jung called participation mystique, an unconscious fusion of identities. The empath cannot tell where their own emotions end and the narcissists begin. One day they're laughing, the next they're drowning in despair that doesn't even belong to them. The narcissist, relieved of their inner poison, grows lighter, while the empath becomes heavier, darker, more fractured inside. Over time, this dynamic becomes a prison. The empath becomes a shadow container, a vessel for everything the narcissist doesn't want to face. Jung wrote, "The healthy man does not torture others. Generally, it is the tortured who turn into torturers." But here, there's a third path: the empath absorbs torture without becoming a torturer. Instead, they carry it silently, at the cost of their own well-being. The more they carry, the more they lose themselves. The narcissist's shame mutates into the empath's self-doubt. The narcissist's rage becomes the empath's anxiety. The narcissist's emptiness becomes the empath's depression. Piece by piece, their reflection in the mirror fades until they barely recognize themselves. Jung called this psychological poisoning, and it is exactly that: a slow erosion of the authentic self. And then comes the breaking point. Not loud, not dramatic, but terrifyingly quiet. One day, the empath wakes up and feels nothing but numbness. The compassion that once defined them feels dead. The hope that kept them moving feels poisoned. The trust that bound them to others feels shattered beyond repair. Jung called this ego death, the collapse of the false self. And for the empath, it is devastating. Their entire identity has been built around being helpful, available, endlessly understanding. When that identity dissolves, they feel like there's nothing left. This is the nigredo, the blackening, the stage of alchemy where everything falls apart into chaos. Jung wrote, "In all chaos, there is a cosmos. In all disorder, a secret order. But when you're in it, there is no order, only darkness." The empath is forced into what I call shadow immersion. They don't just see the darkness, they live inside it. It's not just their pain, it's the pain of others, of generations, of unresolved trauma that has been projected onto them. It feels endless. But here's where the story takes its turn. Jung believed the psyche has an immune system. Just as the body learns to fight off infection, the soul learns to resist foreign shadows. Slowly, silently, the empath begins to develop what I call shadow antibodies. At first, it's just a small refusal, the decision not to answer a message, not to explain themselves, not to step into the same emotional trap. It feels unnatural, even guilty. But it grows. Their nervous system itself begins to change. Where once they absorbed manipulation, now they reject it instinctively. Where once they confused another's anger for their own fault, now they see the projection clearly. Where once they were pulled into chaos, now they can stand in silence. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." And the empath who survives narcissistic abuse doesn't just know darkness, they've lived inside it. They've mapped its terrain, felt its weight, and come back alive. This is the birth of something Jung hinted at but rarely named, the wounded healer. But here, the wound is not from their own shadow. It's from carrying someone else's. And the healing comes not from denying it, but from making it conscious. They become what I call shadow literate. They can read human darkness like a language. They see masks fall before others even realize they're wearing them. They detect manipulation, dishonesty, and projection at levels that no textbook could ever teach. And here's the twist: the narcissist, who thought they were destroying the empath, actually became their greatest teacher. By forcing the empath into the abyss, they unintentionally catalyzed the empath's transformation. What emerges is not the same person who walked into the narcissist's web. It is someone unrecognizable, a survivor, a sovereign being, a soul that no longer carries what isn't theirs. The empath is no longer just a healer. They are a shadow walker, someone who has stared into the abyss and returned with their own light intact, but also changed forever. They are not naive. They are not endlessly available. They are not containers for anyone else's darkness. They are untouchable. And this is the paradox: the narcissist's attempt to consume the empath became the forge that created someone unbreakable. This isn't just recovery, it's evolution. It's what Jung saw as essential for humanity's psychological development. The empath who survives is not simply healed. They are transformed into a new archetype, living proof that darkness, no matter how overwhelming, can be faced, survived, and even transcended. There is a point in life when someone who has always been the caretaker, the listener, the absorber of unspoken pain suddenly realizes they have lost touch with themselves. For empaths, this realization doesn't come gently, it comes after years of carrying other people's storms inside their own body. They have taken in rage that was never theirs, shame that was never theirs, loneliness and emptiness that belonged to someone else, until they look in the mirror and see a stranger staring back. And yet, strangely enough, Jung believed this collapse is not an ending but the beginning of something extraordinary. He once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That choice, however, only becomes possible after the false self has completely died. The false self is the mask that forms from years of pleasing others, smoothing over conflict, and sacrificing your own needs just to keep peace. The narcissist, without even realizing it, becomes the destroyer of that mask. Their relentless attacks on your identity, their constant projections and manipulations, tear apart the false layers until there is nothing left to hide behind. What feels like total destruction is, in Jung's language, the dismemberment that precedes rebirth. At first, this death of the old self feels like chaos, a plunge into a world where nothing makes sense. Gaslighting, contradictions, and impossible demands push the empath so far into nonsense that sense itself has to be rediscovered from within. In this darkness, something ancient stirs awake. Jung called it the self, the archetype of wholeness that lies beneath all conditioning, untouched by projections and roles. When every mask and false identity has been stripped away, this self finally steps forward. It is here that the empath begins to understand they are not their trauma, not the emotions they absorbed, not the compulsive need to rescue others. They are something far more powerful. This is why Jung said the greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For most people, it remains only an idea, but for the empath who survives this crucible, it becomes a lived reality. The transformation is like alchemy, lead turned into gold, darkness turned into light. The relationship with the narcissist becomes the furnace where this transformation takes place. The suffering burns away everything false, and what emerges is the integrated empath, still deeply sensitive, but now surrounded by unshakable boundaries. Jung described this process as the transcendent function, the birth of something new from the meeting of opposites. The empath fuses light with shadow, victim with survivor, wound with wisdom. They do not erase their suffering but instead transform it into strength. Where the narcissist remains trapped in unconscious cycles, blind to their own shadow, the empath becomes hyperconscious. It feels like developing night vision. The same manipulations that once left them broken now look almost transparent. They see the strings before the puppet show begins. And then something even more remarkable happens. The empath's transformation does not just protect them from manipulation, it begins to disrupt manipulation altogether. This is when the empath steps into what I call the shadow walker archetype. They have traveled through psychological hell and return carrying a light that cannot be extinguished. Unlike the traditional wounded healer, who heals through sharing wounds, the shadow walker heals through their wholeness. They embody integration. They have burned away everything false and return carrying knowledge that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Jung once wrote that the purpose of existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. The empath who has survived the narcissist doesn't just kindle a fragile flame, they become a living torch. They expose manipulation not by fighting it, but by seeing it clearly and refusing to carry it. They no longer play the role of shadow container. They are no longer the mirror for someone else's unprocessed pain. They have stepped into sovereignty. And once this happens, the game changes forever. Attempts at manipulation lose their power. Projection no longer sticks. The empath sees through it all, through the drama, through the games, through the illusions. They walk with the clarity of someone who has stared into the abyss and returned, carrying a light that no darkness can ever consume. You spent so much of your life carrying what was never yours. Other people's anger became the weight in your chest, their shame turned into your self-doubt, their emptiness echoed inside you as if it belonged to you. Without realizing it, you had become a container for shadows, silently absorbing what others refused to face. They left you burdened while they walked away lighter, and you thought this was just who you were: the helper, the healer, the one who always understands, the one who always gives. But over time, cracks began to show. Not loud, not dramatic, but subtle fractures that revealed themselves in the mirror when you no longer recognized your own reflection. Your empathy felt poisoned, your hope drained, your trust shattered. It was as if your entire identity had dissolved into someone else's story. Jung described this stage as the nigrado, the blackening phase, where everything stable collapses into chaos. It feels like death. It feels like the end. And yet, within this destruction hides the seed of something new. Because when the old self dies, the self built on pleasing, giving, and avoiding conflict, something indestructible begins to emerge. This is what Jung meant when he said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." The narcissist, in their relentless attack on your identity, unknowingly burned away the mask you wore. They thought they were breaking you, but what they really destroyed was your false self. In that fire, your authentic self was waiting to rise. It didn't happen with fanfare. It came through silence, through moments of terrifying clarity. You stopped explaining yourself to people who were never listening. You stopped carrying emotions that were never yours. You stopped rushing to rescue others from the chaos they created. This quiet refusal became the beginning of your rebirth. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming whole. What I call it is psychological sovereignty, the moment when you finally claim your soul back from everyone who borrowed it. The journey there was not easy. Jung wrote about the night sea journey, a descent into psychological hell where everything familiar is stripped away. You lived this journey. You walked blind through the underworld of projections and manipulations, carrying pain so deep it almost erased you. But when you emerged, you were no longer just an empath. You had become something Jung hinted at but rarely named: a shadow walker. Someone who has faced the abyss, survived it, and returned with their light intact, forever changed. Now, you see darkness with different eyes. Manipulation that once confused you now looks transparent, obvious. Lies that once hooked you now slide off like water on glass. Your nervous system itself has developed immunity, what I call shadow antibodies. It's not that you've hardened, it's that you've awakened. You can sense toxicity the way one senses smoke in the air. You can feel when someone's words and their energy don't match. The tactics that once trapped you now reveal themselves before they even begin. But transformation carries a price. Those who once relied on your endless availability now find you unreachable. They call you cold, accuse you of changing, say you've become distant. And in a way, they're right. You did change. You stopped being their mirror, stopped being their emotional landfill. You stepped out of the unconscious contract you never agreed to, and now your very presence forces them to face themselves. Some lash out, some turn away, but a few, those ready to awaken, are drawn closer, sensing something rare in your energy. This shift is what Jung called the numinous effect, when archetypal energy radiates through a person so strongly that it unsettles everyone around them. People feel it even if they can't explain it. They sense your transformation, the fierce light that no longer allows shadows to hide. And while some resist, others find hope. Empaths still trapped in cycles of abuse see you and realize escape is possible, healing is real, and freedom exists. The paradox is that by refusing to be anyone's emotional sponge, you've become a container in a new way. Not an unconscious absorber, but a conscious vessel with boundaries. You can stand with others in their darkness without drowning in it. You can love without losing yourself. You can care without being consumed. This is what I call the integrated empath, sensitivity wrapped in strength. This is the life of the unconscious empath, the one Jung might say is trapped in the false self. A self built not on truth, but on survival. A self that learned early on that the only way to be safe was to disappear inside other people's needs. And for years, maybe decades, this worked. You were the caretaker, the fixer, the emotional sponge. But deep inside, something was dying, a quiet voice whispering that this wasn't who you truly were. Then came the narcissist, the ultimate mirror of distortion. They didn't just project their darkness onto you, they hurled it, wrapped it around you until you could barely breathe. Their emptiness became your burden. Their chaos became your reality. At first, you tried harder explaining, fixing, proving your worth until the day came when there was nothing left to give. You reached what Jung called the night sea journey, the descent into psychological hell. Everything broke: your identity, your illusions, your hope. You weren't just hurt. You were dismantled. And yet, in this breaking, something extraordinary happened. The false self, the people-pleasing mask, the compulsive giver, the emotional sponge, died. And what remained was raw, authentic, unfiltered. The empath who once absorbed everyone else's projections began to see with terrifying clarity. You stopped explaining yourself to those who were never listening. You stopped running toward emotional emergencies that were never yours to solve. You stopped absorbing storms that were never meant for your sky. What emerged from this death was not the same person who entered the narcissist's web. You became what Jung would call individuated, what I call the boundary beacon. Still sensitive, still deeply feeling, but untouchable in your sovereignty. You didn't harden, you clarified. You didn't close, you rooted. Your empathy, once porous and exploitable, became conscious and precise. You could stand in the presence of pain without being consumed by it. You could love without losing yourself. This transformation doesn't just change you, it changes everything around you. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But now, your reactions are choices. You no longer react out of compulsion. You choose which interactions to enter, which energy to match, which bonds to nurture. Your presence becomes a mirror that reflects truth, not illusions. And when people realize they can't project their shadows onto you anymore, they're forced to face themselves. Some will resent you for this, calling you cold or changed. Others will be drawn to you, sensing a strength they can't quite name. Jung called this the constellation effect. Your consciousness awakens something dormant in others. Without preaching, without teaching, you create ripples of awakening simply by existing as your authentic self. You show other empaths still trapped in cycles of abuse that freedom is real, that they too can reclaim their power. But this evolution comes at a price. Jung warned of the loneliness of individuation. When you no longer play by the unconscious rules of the tribe, you often find yourself standing alone. People you once served may leave, unable to handle your boundaries. But the loneliness you feel now is not emptiness, it's fullness. It's being at home with yourself in a way you never were before. And in that silence, you discover something astonishing. Being alone with your authentic self is far better than being surrounded by people who only loved a version of you that never existed. Over time, you notice something even more profound. The manipulation tactics that once shattered you now slide off like water on glass. Not because you've grown harder, but because you've grown conscious. You see the strings before the puppet show begins. You sense the projection before it lands. You've developed what I call shadow immunity, the ability to walk through the darkness without being swallowed by it. And now, you carry a kind of paradoxical magnetism. The less you need others' approval, the more they seek yours. The less available you are for emotional dumping, the more your boundaries are respected. The more self-contained you are, the more people are drawn to you not out of need, but out of genuine respect for the authenticity you radiate. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The narcissist thought they were destroying you. Instead, they destroyed the false self, leaving only the authentic you behind. They thought they were consuming your light. Instead, they refined it into something unbreakable. Your healing didn't just repair you, it evolved you. Now, you stand as living proof that sensitivity is not weakness. It is strength, sharpened by fire. That empathy is not meant for exploitation, but for conscious connection. That the darkest descent can birth the brightest transformation. You've become what Jung hinted at but rarely named, the shadow walker. Someone who has descended into psychological hell and returned, not broken, but reborn. And your very existence now whispers to others still trapped in shadow, freedom is possible, transformation is real, and everything you thought would destroy you might just be the fire that forges you into who you were always meant to become.